Hi, I'm Andy Russell, President and CEO for Southern California's flagship PBS stations, PBS SoCal and KCET. We're delighted to co-present this fourth and final discussion in the multi-part Finding Your Roots National Conversation Series with PBS stations across the country. Through virtual gatherings like this conversation series, we're providing a way of connecting with the communities we serve and of meeting people where they are. In everything that we do, we carry forward our deep commitments to serving our diverse community, to advancing the values of inclusion, and to supporting progress towards greater equity. Our essential mission of public media is to support an informed and engaged population. The Finding Your Roots series plays an essential role in this mission. Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr. said this about Finding Your Roots. It is so important today to show what we have in common as Americans and as human beings, despite our apparent differences. The stories we find in the guests' family trees demonstrate repeatedly that we are a fundamentally blended nation that draws strength from our diversity. I hope you enjoy today's conversation. For more information, please visit pbs.org/findingyourroots. And of course, tell all of your friends to check out Season 9 on the free PBS app and Passport. Thank you for joining us.
My heart is racing right now.
Fasten your seatbelt.
You're uncovering the truth.
These are consequential things.
Yeah.
Oh, look at everybody.
I feel the presence of all these people.
I've got history.
No.
I wish my ma could be here to see this.
Amazing.
It's like the most vital stuff, right?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Thomas Allen Harris, creator of the Family Pictures Institute for Inclusive Storytelling, based at Yale University, where I am professor in the practice in African American Studies and Film and Media Studies. I'm thrilled to be back to serve as moderator for this fourth and final installment of Finding Your Roots, Season 9, National Conversation Series. Finding Your Roots Family Album Series Highlights. We have an amazing opportunity today to hear from three individuals who know this program quite well. Professor Henry Louis Gates, executive producer, writer, and host of Finding Your Roots. Professor Gates is the Alphonse Fletcher University professor and director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. He is an Emmy and Peabody Award-winning filmmaker, literary scholar, journalist, cultural critic, and institution builder. I am also pleased to welcome CeCe Moore and Natalia Warchol, who both participated in early conversations from the series. CeCe Moore is lead genetic genealogist for Finding Your Roots and has been a core production member for the series for a decade. CeCe is a pioneer in the use of autosomal DNA to resolve unknown parentage, family mysteries, and criminal cases. Often referred to as the face of genetic genealogy, her work has been featured on hundreds of broadcasts and in thousands of articles around the world. And Natalia Warchol, the series producer on Finding Your Roots since 2019. Okay, let's dive in. There was a viral moment in this series when the activist and scholar Angela Davis learned about her family connection to the Mayflower. And this one is for everyone. What stories from Season 9 really excited you?
Well, that certainly excited me. I was excited to see her reaction. And as millions of people saw, she was stunned. And Angela Davis has been through a lot. But I don't think that I've ever seen her more astonished than she was at that moment. And she says something to the effect, this is too much to process. When I cracked up. I'm always asked, what are my favorite stories? I never have had a bad shoot. We never have had a bad script. I've liked the guests and I like their stories. So I made a little short list and I know I have to pick one. So it involves the Salem witch trials. And this is just such a coincidence, ladies and gentlemen, that we couldn't believe it. And it involves Claire Danes and Jeff Daniels. And Claire Danes and Jeff discovered that they have ancestors on opposite sides of the Salem witch trials. Claire's ninth great grandmother was accused of bewitching her neighbor's cattle, found guilty, and hanged. On the other hand, Jeff's eighth great grandfather was an accuser who was involved in two trials that both ended in executions. So there's no evidence that Claire and Jeff's ancestors knew each other, but there were only a handful of people living in Salem in the early 1690s. So I would bet anything that they did. But what are the odds? We just picked people randomly, and we found out that their ancestors, one, a ninth great grandmother, and two, an eighth great grandfather, were on opposite sides of this heinous moment in the early American history. So I love that. I love that story, and I love that episode.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. It's something that they would absolutely not been able to tell before this. And I wonder how did you make those connections in terms of, there's so many different routes you could follow and paths genetically to find those particular ones. Maybe CeCe and Natalia can share about that.
It's actually too far back, likely to be able to find that genetically. So that is a paper trail discovery. And that is our traditional genealogical research, digging into those documents going way back into colonial America.
CeCe's absolutely right. And when we started the series, 90% or more of our reveal was based just on the paper trail. The DNA science related to ancestry was in its infancy. Then in 2009, we were introduced to autosomal DNA by two brilliant geneticists at the Broad Institute. And then everything changed. The BC and AD in the history of finding your roots is the day I met CeCe Moore. CeCe Moore, as we all learned in a brilliant profile 2 Decembers ago in the New Yorker, is a genius. And CeCe changed everything for how we trace ancestry.
Dr. Gates, you were the first to be talking about autosomal DNA, genetic genealogy on television. So you're really the pioneer as far as introducing that to the public. I remember before I knew you watching your show, I believe it was Faces of America, where you first talked about DNA cousins and using autosomal DNA to find people that were related to each other. I was absolutely fascinated, and the rest is history.
And I have really gotten a second education because of finding your roots. In this case, to answer your question, we just follow the paper trail and see where it leads. And then, we can't use all these stories, right? Remember, your number of ancestors doubles with each generation. So you have 64 fourth grade grandparents, 64. That's a lot of branches on the family tree. So we're going to find something. And then we want to pair that something with what we find in another guest. Sometimes it's two Civil War ancestors, one for the North, one for the South, or two ancestors who were in the American Revolution, one who was a loyalist and one who was a patriot. Or, we group them by occupation, like two chefs or two athletes, whatever it might be. So this was just, we followed the paper trail, and lo and behold, we connected in Salem, Massachusetts in the early 1690s. It was, you can't make it happen, but that's how it happened, and I loved it. One of the most poignant moments for me was when there's a famous illustration of convicted so-called witches being hanged. And Claire Danes is looking at this painting. And I said, Claire, you see that figure on the right? And she said, yeah. I said, that's your ninth great grandmother. And she just her look of shock and recognition, all of a sudden, the Salem witch trials, which we'd all heard about from the time we were in elementary school, became real, palpable, and personal for her. And the depth of horror that she experienced, I think, communicated to Americans watching the show of what an evil moment this was in American history.
Wow. It's yeah, it's what's amazing for me is that the it moves our history from myth into something that's deeply personal, as you're saying, Professor Gates. And it's a way for, it's finding your roots, but it's also finding our roots as a country,
My first degree is in history, and my second degree is in English literature. And what do they have in common? Stories, right? The love of stories. This is a way of seducing people into learning American history and world history through the family trees of famous people, the celebrities who are our guests. And that's what the teacher in me loves, doing pedagogy in this way, because we can teach people world history in a way that is not intimidating. God knows it's not boring. It's not stressful. All of a sudden, people know more about the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide or the Irish potato famine or African slavery, the transatlantic slave trade. Or who knew that many of the conquistadors who ended up in Cuba and other parts of the Spanish America, as it were, started on the Canary Islands. That because Spain colonized the Canary Islands in 1420. So we just did Jim Acosta, and we were able to trace his family tree back to 7 and 8 grandparents in the 1600s on the Canary Islands. And then they came to Cuba in the year 1733 from the Canary Islands. That's amazing. I mean, before I started doing Finding Roots, I didn't know anything about the Canary Islands. So I didn't know anything about the history of Cuba either. Well, except my wife is a Cuban historian. So, now I know a lot about it. But I love that. The teacher in me loves the active learning that is implicit in every episode of Finding Your Roots. And I think that's one reason that it's so popular.
Mm-hmm. How do you and Natalia work together in terms of this series, producer? What kind of back and forth happens behind the scenes?
She just tells me what to do all the time. Look, Natalia sent me 3 emails a day and 2 phone calls giving me orders. It's like I had to say, I didn't know I was in the Army. Hello. Natalia is always cheerful, always engaged, always focused, extraordinarily well organized, has great energy, and I love working with her. We have the ideal team: Sabin Streeter, Natalia, CeCe, Kim Morgan, Nick Sheedy, and several other people. I don't want to just give a catalog list of names, but we have great chemistry. We push each other. We'll do a rehearsal. We'll do a rehearsal on tomorrow, and we'll do a rehearsal the next day for 2 guests that we're filming in the next 2 weeks. We go over every line. I do them right here. I'm in the kitchen in my house in Harvard Square, and I use this Jonathan Green painting over my shoulder to square the Zoom. And we'll spend a couple hours at least going over every line, saying, no, this story doesn't work. It needs to be developed, or practicing phonetics, because I have to learn how to speak all kinds of languages, the hardest in the world being Polish, which is the mother tongue of Natalia. And I never get it right. Thomas Allen is horrible. So I say, did I say it right, Natalia? He's like, no. Say it again. I go, click, the Zoom is over.
You get a lot of things right. It's a hard language. Most of it you get right. Skip gets A- in Polish phonetics.
That is so cold. A- at Harvard is like an F.
One of Skip's great talents is putting together an amazing team. He has the most incredible team that he's put together for this series. Everyone is just so great to work with, so brilliant, so talented. We are incredibly fortunate. And that is truly one of your talents, Skip, is finding good people and keeping them close.
Thank you. Well, I mean, it's very kind of you to say, but I love people. And I'd like to think that's obvious in my interactions with the guests. But I came to Harvard in 1991, 32 years ago, and my mandate was to rebuild a basically defunct, moribund Department of Afro-American Studies, as it was called then. And now we have 41 professors. It's the #1 in the world. We have a PhD program. We have the largest African language program in the world. That's it. I mean, I'm just a born entrepreneur and institution builder. There's nothing I can do about it, which is one reason I like documentary filmmaking. You know, it's a cliche that film is a group effort, but it really is. That it's not a solo sport, as it were. It is a team sport, and it can only work if you have people smarter than you are. I didn't go to film school. I went to Cambridge University, for goodness sake. After I went to Yale, I was always a film junkie, but I didn't take one course in filmmaking. That's where Sabin, Natalia, and our producers come in. I took biology, but I didn't take a course in genetics. That's where CeCe comes in. And CeCe not only has educated us, but she's educated America about the wonders of DNA.
Absolutely. Well, there's a whole move in the documentary world right now about the impact of documentary films on subjects. One of the things I was thinking about was how getting all this information impacts people's lives after, you know, these people who are come to the show, and, you know, how that might affect them.
Well, we have an ethics protocol so that if we discover something about your ancestry that is extremely personal and surprising and potentially quite upsetting, I would send you an email, Thomas, and I would say, are you free to talk? So everybody knows it's like not good news, right? And you would say, yeah. So I have it written out. CeCe gave me my ethics protocol, and it goes like this. Thomas, we've discovered something in our research that is forever going to change your understanding of your family. Do you want to know or not? And so everybody says, yeah, right? And then I'd say, Thomas, your daddy's not your daddy. You go, what? So I go, yeah. And now I have to do that privately. I can't do this. It's not like the Jerry Springer show, you know, like I have to give you the chance, one, to process it, but also to just disappear from the series. Because if you stay in the series, we are going to reveal that in front of millions of people. And generally people stay in the series. It's not always what we call a non-paternity event, but it's often a non-paternity event, sometimes for the next generation up, like a grandmother or grandfather had an affair, so that the person you thought was your grandmother, grandfather is not really. Well, in Todd's case, in LL Cool J's case, his mother, very much alive, as it turns out, was adopted. And we found that out in our research, and he had no idea. So it was the first one of these calls that I ever had to make. He was so upset because he worshiped his grandparents for taking them in. His grandfather became his surrogate father, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at his video, Mama, I'm gonna knock you out, he's boxing in a boxing rink in the basement of a brownstone. And at the end, this nice lady comes down the steps, says, Todd, take the garbage out. And that was his grandmother. Except it wasn't his natural grandmother. So I had to walk him through that. And he was, you know, yelling at me. He was so upset. I felt sorry for him. And he said, well, what am I supposed to do? And I said, well, if I were you, I'd call my mother. And 5 minutes later, Thomas, he called me back and I said, oh my God, this guy's going to yell at me all over again. And I said, Todd, what'd your mom say? And he said, Mom said, could my father be my father, but my mother not be my natural mother, which meant to me that she had suspected that she was adopted. And after that, it was smooth sailing. And then we found this, the punchline, we found Todd's biological grandmother, 88 years old, living in a nursing home, and introduced Todd, his mother, and his mother to her mother. And so they had a relationship, I think, for the last 5 years of Todd's grandmother's life. And it opened up a whole new family for him and a whole new identity, and solved this mystery that had been implicitly, subconsciously haunting Todd's mother since she was an adolescent. So it's just an amazing story. Oh, and Todd's hobby is boxing. Turns out his grandfather was a boxer and, and became the trainer of his brother, who is the light heavyweight champion of the world. Now, go figure. Now, you can't make that up, Mr. Filmmaker.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. That's amazing.
If we were in your film class and somebody wrote a script like that, you'd say, hey, come on. Too many coincidences. This is like rubbish. It can't work, right?
That's sci-fi.
Sci-fi.
But it is true. We find this so often. I think, Skip, you talk a lot about patterns repeating in one's family tree and trickling down through the generations without people knowing. And even this season 9, we had 2 little discoveries, little moments that I thought were just pretty profound, even though they were so sort of small. Like, we had David Duchovny, who, in his 50s released his first novels. And one of those novels was called Holy Cow. It dealt with, it was about a cow at a dairy farm. And lo and behold, we show him a census for, modern day Ukraine, the Russian Empire census of 1897, showing his ancestors were dairy farmers, and he had no idea. So these are like little moments, like little things that really are exciting for us as we discover them and research them, and can really be profound for the guest. Same with Claire Danes, whose grandmother, her namesake Claire, wrote a thesis on Shakespeare's use of dance in his plays, and Claire had no idea about that. As a Juliet in the Romeo and Juliet adaptation, movie adaptation, and had no idea that her grandmother was involved in theater arts as a young woman, and that really was also profound for Claire. So sometimes it's not these big stories, but those little pieces of kernels of information that can be really also very grounding, like you said, Thomas, like grounding and like, oh, this makes sense. This is why I am the way I am. Yeah, this now makes sense to me.
Going back to LL Cool J's story, that to this day is one of my absolute favorite outcomes. And I think that was the first time we were able to fully demonstrate the power of genetic genealogy to the public. And so we've had many more discoveries since then, but that one really, for me, is a milestone. When I started with the show, my goal was to display that, to illustrate what we could do with genetic genealogy, what kind of incredible discoveries we could make for people. And so that was really the beginning of being able to illustrate that to the public and to the Finding Your Roots viewers.
Yeah, and Thomas, I was saying, I'd call her in the middle of the night. CeCe, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure?
So did Todd.
Are you really sure?
Yes, Todd was calling me at 2 a.m. after he would finish filming, saying, are you positive? This is really true. And, it was very clear from the DNA that was the situation. And then we had to unravel it from there. First, you can just see, okay, he's not related to the people he thinks he is on his mom's side. But then the next step is, okay, who is he related to then? And we had much smaller databases at that point. So it was pretty difficult work. The dad's side, his grandfather's side, was not as difficult because we had a fantastic top match. But on the other side, I really had to dig deep into those second, third, fourth cousins, going back into slavery, actually. And so that was a big feat at that time. Now we do that for many of our guests, but that, as I said, was really the beginning, I think, of being able to demonstrate that power of genetic genealogy.
And using genetic genealogy, we can get beyond what are called brick walls for a lot of people. Brick walls mean it's where the paper trail ends. And sometimes there's a gap. You can't figure out what happens between, I'm making this up, but 1850 and 1800. But CeCe can then go around all that genetically and say, okay, you descend from this couple who were born in 1750, right? And then she pieces together how that relationship can be demonstrated genetically, even if we can't find the paper trail, which is remarkable.
The show continually evolves for people who are participating. And I love that you have all of these stories in your head. It's part of your aura, your whole, it's that they become in some ways part of you.
I don't even know I know the stories until I start talking, right? I still have it. I have a flash drive for my Finding Your Roots PowerPoint. And I used to make an outline for every guest in the series. This was up through the series of Barbara Walters was it. I don't even know what season it was. I actually had memorized key details of each of my guests, but I can't do it now. I mean, I need a memory palace, because we've had too many guests. But there are certain moments that stick out. And then I ask, I'm getting an award in May. The series is called A Life of Learning. And my lecture is called A Life of Relearning because I had to educate myself in genealogy and genetics as a full professor, at Harvard University. I had to start at the beginning and to pursue a second career, which is really exciting. Starting the series was like going back to graduate school. I've learned a lot, but I've had very good teachers. Natalia and Sabin teach me consistently things about documentary filmmaking, and CeCe and Kim Morgan teach me a lot about genetic genealogy, and Nick Sheedy, our lead genealogist, teaches me a lot about the archives. It's a great communal learning experience, but these details do stick to me. There's no question about that.
Well, there's no better dinner companion than Skip, because he has stories on stories on stories. It is the most entertaining dinner you will ever have.
No, that's because that wine CeCe makes me drink.
Coupled with good wine. Yeah.
Well, that's the magic of the series. That you could see how much people not only appreciate the discovery, but also appreciate the time together, with you, Skip. And I think now is actually a great moment to watch a clip with actress Viola Davis learning about a surprising family secret.
I started with Viola. She was born on a plantation in South Carolina where her mother's family had lived for generations. And she still feels a deep tie to the place, even though she didn't stay there long. So when someone asks you, Viola Davis, who are your people? Where do you come from? What do you say?
I always say I came from Singleton Plantation in St. Matthews, South Carolina. I was born in my grandmother's sharecropper's house. Mm-hmm. And that's usually it. It stops there. I mean, once we moved to Rhode Island when I was 2 months old, I sort of lost that connection to my family in South Carolina.
So you don't think of yourself as a native of Rhode Island? Though you spent so much time there, you went to school there.
Yeah, I would call that my home. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting that when I talk about where my home, I always talk about where I was born.
Right.
And I think the disconnect from Rhode Island is just the black side of me going, it was just hard integrating into that culture. So then I always revert back to my birth.
Yeah, and where your people are from.
The purest form, yeah.
While Viola may feel bonded to her mother's people, she knew very little about their lives. We focused first on her mother's parents, Henry and Moselle Logan. They were both born in St. Matthews, South Carolina. And we found them in the town's archives in the year 1942, making a very significant decision.
Signatures of contracting parties, Henry Logan, Moselle Howell.
That's your grandparents' marriage certificate. What's it like to see that?
Awesome. I mean, people that made you who you are, you wouldn't be born if it weren't for them.
That's right.
And yet you don't really know them, then all of a sudden you're seeing it, right? It's pretty incredible.
They were married on September 19th, 1942. Henry was 22. Your grandmother Moselle was just 15.
Same age as my mom and dad when they got married.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Same spread.
Age. Wow.
The Logans were married for 37 years. and had at least 18 children together. But as we scoured the records that they left behind, we noticed something unusual. A secret that Viola's grandfather, Henry, had largely kept to himself. In his Social Security application, filed in the early 1940s, Henry's father is listed as being a man named Gable Logan. But when Henry passed away in 1979, his obituary said something very different.
He was a son of the late John Young and Mrs. Corinne Ravenel Logan. Oh.
Ooh. Well, according to this obituary, Henry's father was a man named John Young, not Gable Logan. Did your mom ever talk about this?
Never.
Isn't that interesting? That silence?
Silence is always interesting to me.
Records show that Henry's mother, Corinne, married Gable Logan in 1912, and that they were still married when Henry was born in May of 1920. But of course, that doesn't prove that Gable was Henry's father. So we set out to see what else we could learn about Gable and Corinne, and we found a surprise. Could you please turn the page?
Oh, Corinne, what are you doing?
Viola, this record is dated July 18th, 1919. Would you please read the transcribed section?
Passenger list of colored casuals returning to the United States. Port of departure, Brest, France, to Camp Mills, New York, arrived July 18th, 1919. Name, Logan Gable. Address, St. Matthews, South Carolina.
Any idea what you're looking at?
He must have served during, this would be World War I, right?
That's right. That's a list of black soldiers returning from serving in France during World War I, and Gable Logan was on that ship. Did you know?
No, nobody talks about that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly possible that Gable got off this ship and went home to his wife and conceived your grandfather. However, there's just one problem. Do you see where the men on this ship were headed? They're coming back to Camp Mills.
Camp Mills, yep, I see it right there, Camp Mills.
Gable got off his ship and went to a military base in Long Island, New York.
Oh.
And we found no evidence that he ever went back to South Carolina.
Wow.
So what do you think happened?
I think Corinne, I don't know, got bored, had a disconnect, and went with someone else while he was away. And I think that that was a very short-lived relationship.
Viola's theory was seemingly supported by the 1920 census for South Carolina, where we saw Corinne living with her parents just 4 doors away from a familiar name.
John Young, head, black, age 35, married. Oof. Occupation, farmer. Josephine, wife, black, age 27.
Recognize any names there?
Yeah, John Young.
What's it like to see that?
It's like life, you know? It's people getting with other people who are married. It's the mess of relationships and the mess of, you know, love, sex. It's
lust,
truth.
Yep, lust, desire.
Yeah.
At this point, it seemed quite likely that Henry's father was John Young and not Gable Logan. But we had to be certain, so we turned to DNA. Since Viola's mother is 1 generation closer to Henry, we asked her to take a DNA test. We then compared her genetic profile to millions of other profiles in publicly available databases. And we saw that she had no matches to anyone in the extended Logan family, meaning that Henry definitely was not Gable's son. But that still left us with a question. Now, of course, the fact that Gable wasn't Henry's father does not mean that John Young was.
Exactly.
So we returned to the DNA databases and immediately noticed a cluster of matches that were all related to your mother through one couple. And based on the amount of DNA that your mother shares with the descendants of that couple, we confirmed that they were your mother's great-grandparents biologically, genetically linked to your mother through one of their children. In fact, a son, to be exact.
Wow.
That son is Henry's father, and that son is your mother's biological grandfather. You want to meet him?
Yes, absolutely.
Could you please turn the page? Viola, would you please read the name in the box with a yellow border on the chart in front of you?
John Young.
John Young.
Yeah. Wow. It makes me know that I entered this world with a big old load from the moment I came out of my mother's womb.
Right.
I'm the amalgamation of a lot of stories and a lot of secrets.
Well, such a moving story, and to have this discovery and also compassion around the story and the ancestors' secrets. You know, there's a way in which, in some ways, there's a spiritual aspect to the series, and you seem to be conveying something that you know, if it hadn't been for the series, we never would have had access to this. You know, whether it's a guest and also their sharing. And so I was just wondering how you thought about that, Professor Gates.
Well, I mean, who would have thought that being introduced to an ancestor would make a person burst into tears? But it does over and over and over again. I've had to learn to give people time to process information. Remember when I sit down with you and give you your book of life, I know what's in the book of life, right? But you don't. You're hearing it for the first time. So I have to let you process that. And I've learned, I'm sure I can always be better, but I've learned how to give people space and just listen, give the information and wait, and then let them come back to me. And so it's made me a better listener just as a human being. But I actually believe that our ancestors are suspended in a kind of genealogical purgatory. And they're waiting for us to discover the vaults in which they've been suspended. And when our researchers discover those vaults and open them, they tell us stories which have somehow magically, osmotically trickled down through the branches of your family tree. And as Natalia said, with David Duchovny, I'm writing a novel, Holy Cow. Well, holy cow, your ancestor raised cows. And that's just one of so many examples. The examples you gave of Claire Danes and just so many others that people are playing out motifs that have been passed down in the family, not explicitly, not verbally, but implicitly, or family secrets. The Yoruba have an expression that's a riff on Freud's Return of the Repressed, though the person who coined this phrase in Yoruba did not know about Sigmund Freud. But in Yoruba, its translation is, the corpse you buried in your backyard last week is poking its toe through the soil today. That's the Return of the Repressed. People think that if I don't repeat it, this poor child will never have to suffer that pain. But they're living out that story in so many nonverbal ways. So everybody knows there's an elephant in the room, to mix my metaphors. Everybody knows that there's something back there that is weird. And it produces all kinds of aberrant behavior. And so our job is to unmask the elephant that's been in the room the whole time. And that's very exciting. And it gives people a lot of relief. When I was interviewing Larry David, he said, this is therapy. This is like therapy. You know, you're like my psychiatrist. And it is. There is a part of it that is quite therapeutic. And I hope loving. I have to tell people some bad things. I had to tell a couple people that their relatives were Nazis, for example, or Confederates, or that they owned slaves. And but I never judge. You know, that's not my job to judge. I don't believe that guilt is heritable. I don't believe you're responsible for the crazy stuff your ancestors did. I just try to present it out lay out the facts, like it's 44 degrees here in Harvard Square today. You know, that's just the fact. And also make people feel better about the bad things that their ancestors did as well.
I think that's a great segue to bring in a question from our audience. Natalia, I think you may be able to answer this question best. And this one is from Audra O, viewer from Nevada. She said, when deciding what stories to highlight in the show, how do you narrow them down?
Oh, geez, that's a big question. Very big question. I think we touched upon this when we first started talking about the Salem witch trials for the stories for Claire Danes and Jeff Daniels. It's a case by case. It's always, because like Dr. Gates said, you never really know what you're going to get, right? It's like you get the guest to be on the show and you open a Pandora box of just ancestry and, you know, secrets and whatever. So we always start with building out the tree via the paper trail. And obviously CeCe checks that, make sure that everyone on the tree, that the DNA is all kosher. Sometimes it's not, of course. But we build up, you know, we start off with pure genealogy, just finding paper trail for every single person on the tree for as many people as we can, right? So we populate that tree, we build this tree, we have this tree, and the next step is for our amazing team of researchers, associate producers, and producers to research every single person on this tree, which takes a lot of time, of course. And they compile all this research and we all sit down and sort of brainstorm, okay, what stories are the most intriguing? What stories have we not covered on this show yet? Or what stories will the guest most relate to that we think? Obviously, we don't know. It's always a guess, but we do a deep dive in every guest's biography and career. And sometimes you can see through what they've been through their experience and their hardships, what stories they may relate to that their ancestors, you know, went through. So there's no easy answer to this. It's really, you know, what we think will make our guest respond best. And obviously, if it's a story we've never told, we jump at it. I think with Joe Manganiello, one example is, you know, the Armenian genocide. It was really the first time we ever had, I believe it was the first time we had an ancestor of the survivor. So it was a no-brainer for us that we're going to tell that story versus a story on another maternal branch. And also a part of the sort of preparation for us is for each guest fills out a genealogy questionnaire, and one or two of the questions on that questionnaire are, what are you most interested in? What are some of the family lores, family secrets that you'd like to explore? And that's always, of course, the first thing we focus on. That's the blueprint. And then, of course, if we find some incredible, amazing other story, you know, we also present that. And we try to do as many stories as we can and show them as much as we can, but we only have a limited, you know, we only have so much time with the guests and we only have so much time within the broadcast. So it's always a tough choice. We face some challenges when picking the stories.
I don't think most people realize that Skip spends 4 or 5 hours sometimes with these guests going over family stories, and we have to cut it down to less than half an hour, or the editors have to cut it down, I should say. And so it really comes down to what they react to. What we'll sometimes think there's a fantastic story, and then they don't have as much of a reaction to it. Like Skip was explaining, it's unpredictable what somebody might emotionally connect to. And that is, in the end, I think, what really determines which ones make the series.
It's true. And it took me a while to learn that. You know, when I started, I'm a professor, you know, we lecture, right? So I thought the success of the series was about Professor Gates's brilliant renditions on the Civil War and the American. And the producer said, we can't use any of that. I go, why? They go, because you talk too much. You know, my job is to get the guests to talk. My job is to evoke from them thoughtful comments and emotion. and not to lecture them. There's some, inevitably I have to tell them, what is the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire? Or when was the Irish famine? Or, when did the Ottoman Turks, kill the Armenians, et cetera, et cetera. But a story only works if a guest comes back to us and reflects on what they have just encountered. Often we've had fabulous shoots. The guests would leave really pumped up. 6 months later, I'd look at an edit and I go, how come you didn't use the story? And Sabin and Natalia would say, all he said was, wow. Wow. You can only go so far with wow, you know what I'm saying?
We get a lot of wows.
You get a lot of wow,
So a lot seems to rest on the research, having a lot of different strands to offer. Were there any, particularly CeCe and Natalia, were there any stories that were particularly hard to research, to give like a kind of breadth of material from to which the guests could respond to, while Dr. Gates is speaking with them?
I think there are always challenges because we want to fully explore both sides of the family tree, and we want to give them stories on both sides of the tree. And sometimes one side is pretty straightforward and we find so much interesting material there. And then the other side can be very, very difficult. A lot of it is based on population group. Are we in the United States? Can we dig deep into the past, or do we run into that brick wall of slavery very quickly? And what is the DNA telling us? So I think for me, one of the really difficult genetic genealogy research stories was Julia Roberts. Her second great grandfather story was incredibly difficult. And we typically think if somebody is white and, their family's been in the United States a long time, that those are the ones that are going to be most straightforward. But for some reason, it was incredibly challenging. And I'm a big fan of Julia. So I really wanted to do a great job for everybody, for our team and also for her. And it was on her direct paternal line, her surname line. So it's pretty significant. I probably spent 200 hours trying to sort out the DNA matches. We had her dad's first cousin tested as well. And there were a lot of discrepancies between the amount of DNA that she was sharing and what he was sharing with people. And it taught me new things and surprised me in ways I had not been surprised about with DNA before, just the randomness of autosomal DNA inheritance and seeing anomalies and outliers. And so finally being able to come up with a solution on that was huge for me. But the African-American trees and the African-American genetic genealogy research is continually a challenge for us. And I'm so thankful I have Kimberly Morgan now as my partner on that, because it can take us 100 hours, 200 hours sometimes to try to sort out what the DNA is telling us about someone's family history.
Yeah, it's not as if a person spits in the test tube and then a story comes popping out the other end of this, analyzing machine. It's sleuth work. I think it's magic, but it's such an art and a science too. Because as she said, she has to piece together the tale from clues, bits and pieces, and say, oh my God, this pattern indicates this result. And that takes a long, long time. Right. It's wonderful. We had one guest, Thomas, who had to wait 5 years for a DNA mystery to be solved. And I know she got so upset, but we were waiting for a match and we got it. And it blew our mind,
We have one other question from Margaret L. in Virginia, and I'll hand this to you, Natalia. What is the process for creating the Book of Life, and where do you begin?
Well, every Book of Life begins with research. And then from, like I said, we do sort of the broad strokes research. Then we go, we go macro, then we go micro, and then, we select the stories we're going to tell, and then we have to script them. So this is another sort of step in the process that we just talked about. Once CeCe and Kim do their magic, you still have to craft the story. We have the end, we have the result, we know what happened. Now we have to build up emotionally to how we're going to present it, so that there's sort of a 3-act dramatic structure, right? And then there's a climax. So we script, we have an amazing team, we script, and then the Book of Life is based on that script. Every page in the Book of Life is a page of the script. So every page has to have, either some sort of a visual, either a photograph or a document based off of which we have scripted a particular page. So, it's a lot of printing, cutting, pasting, photoshopping of documents, highlighting in Photoshop, and then just printing on a good photo paper, cutting it and pasting it into the Book of Life. So,
and it's kind of old school. I mean, it's cutting and pasting. It's not digital. And sometimes they're inserting pages at the last minute, things. And so, there are a lot of different talents and skills that the team needs to have.
Yes. A lot of gluing and taping and yes, last minute issues with things falling up. Yeah. Falling up. Yes. So.
And remember, the logic is the narrative arc. Like all these bits and pieces in the scrapbook are telling a story that's going to have a series of climaxes, not just one big climax, but there'll be these peaks, and then you start over, and then another peak, and a different beat. It's great. It's just storytelling at its finest. And you know all about that as a filmmaker.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Professor Gates. The last question is from Emily C. from Montana, who wrote and asked about finding information about guests who are from another country. Is that more difficult, less difficult? How is it, considering we're all part of larger diasporas, how do you go about that? And is that a particular challenge?
It absolutely is. It is much easier for us to find records in the United States, and our core team often can do that. When we are working with a guest who has recent immigrant roots and we've got to get back into other countries pretty quickly, then we will often hire foreign researchers, but we have to lay the foundation. We have to know what questions to ask and to direct them toward. And I think Natalia can then talk about how we do that, but we definitely do need expertise from genealogists in other countries who are more familiar with those particular records and resources.
To piggyback on what CeCe just said, our genealogy team, our lead genealogist and CeCe all have to do the groundwork first to first and foremost determine where, outside of the United States, a particular ancestor came from. So that's step one. And then, the hard part is a lot of the times, most of the time, you have to sort of relinquish control and trust that the person you're working with in the particular country will do the work up to your standards. We have a huge network of local researchers on the ground that we've worked with for years and everywhere. I'm going to say in most of Europe for sure, and a lot of countries of Latin America and Israel. So yeah, unfortunately, the answer is you have to find someone in the foreign country and hire them to do this research for you, for the most part. Not a lot of countries have robust digital databases. Some do. Scotland notably has a great, robust digital, their records have been digitized. A lot of, Jewish Gen, JRI Poland are doing fantastic work in digitizing documentation for Jewish people who lived in Eastern Europe before World War II. So there are resources. Unfortunately, not everything, but most of the things we need aren't digitized, or even if they are indexed, you still need someone to actually physically retrieve a document from the archive. So in other words, short answer is we have to hire local researchers to do this research for us.
We're fortunate that there are billions of records that have been digitized, and partly thanks to the LDS Church and Family Search, we can start with those. And as Natalia said, those indices can really be a huge help and tell us what we need pulled. But then in the end, we need those boots on the ground.
lots of people think, well, I'm from this place, so I bet you can't trace my family tree. Take Cuba. Most of the records have not been digitized in Cuba. But we have some of our most fascinating stories have involved Cuban ancestry. Why? Because Cuba was a colony of Spain until 1898. So the Spanish Empire kept fabulous records, and the dominant religion was the Roman Catholic Church. So every parish priest would, it was presented to me today, a boy, 3 days old. His name is Thomas Allen, son of Thomas Harris. And all these little scraps of paper, man, they're just sitting in the basement of a church, in an attic, in a county courthouse, and whatever. And they're still there, even in Cuba. I have to say, our Cuban research is coordinated by Lourdes del Pino, a brilliant Cuban genealogist who lives in Miami, and my wife, Mariel Iglesias Utzet, the prominent historian who taught at the University of Havana for 25 years and who has a network of graduate students all over the island. And she sends them out to these churches and they're finding all these records. It's wonderful. The Chinese, Korean, Japanese people had kept clan genealogies. Unfortunately, they were long on detail for men. That's good. Short on detail about women.
Wow, this has been a wonderful conversation. I feel like I've learned so much, and I'm an even greater fan of the show. So to close out this discussion, I think what everyone watching wants to know is anything special in store for season 10?
After years of being implored to trace the ancestry of a quote unquote ordinary person, we are giving America what it wants. We have done an open competition. Over 8,000 people submitted applications. They had to tell us about a family mystery. And Natalia and Sabin and the team and narrowed it down to a list of 10, and they're in their process of choosing the average person. So that is the biggest news, I think, in season 10. Natalia, CeCe, what do you think?
I think that's the biggest piece of news. We're very excited and hope to have more of an update for everyone, as soon as we can. We're working as soon as we possibly can to narrow it down. So
I think otherwise, it's just that there will be more DNA stories as the databases have grown. And as I now have Kim working with me, we've been able to find even more incredible genetic genealogy discoveries. And as the seasons have progressed, I think we've been more and more successful in doing that. So people can look forward to seeing even more genetic genealogy.
Wonderful. Well, it sounds like the people who are going to be selected, or the person's going to be selected, it'll be like winning the lottery, the Finding Your Roots lottery. And
it's true.
I think that's a great note to end on. I'd like to thank our panelists for their time and insights this evening. We're grateful for the opportunity to sit down with you all and for this incredible conversation. Thank you to our host stations, WETA and PBS SoCal, for their much appreciated efforts in putting this event together. We hope you've enjoyed season 9 of Finding Your Roots and participating in this national conversation series. Don't forget to come back in early 2024 for another exciting season of Finding Your Roots. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Thomas.
all right. Thank you.